We are back with more of our conversation with Amal and George Clooney. Look at the way these two look at each other. I can't get over this. The power couple joined us in studio on a very big day for them. It was their 8th wedding anniversary.
He said it for almost 20 years, in almost every interview, on almost every red carpet, with the same easy smile, he would never get married again. George Clooney meant it too. He had already tried marriage once, it had ended, and he had built an entire second life around the idea that he was done with it forever. Then one summer evening at his villa on Lake Como, a mutual friend asked if they could bring someone by. George said yes, the way he said yes to almost anything. And the woman who walked through that door didn't just change his evening. She quietly took apart everything he thought he knew about himself, piece by piece, until the most famous bachelor in the world became a husband, then a father, and then something far more complicated than either of those words suggests. This is the real story of how George Clooney's life turned inside out, why it took the right woman almost 50 years to find him, and why the transformation cost him more than the public ever realized. For most of his adult life, George Clooney had turned being single into something close to an art form. It wasn't just that he wasn't married. Plenty of famous men aren't married. What Clooney did was different. He made bachelorhood look like a philosophy, almost a public service. He had the villas in Italy and Lake Como, the motorcycles, the rotating cast of famous friends, the pig named Max that he kept for nearly 2 decades, the pranks he pulled on Brad Pitt and Matt Damon that became almost as famous as his films. He gave interviews explaining, calmly and without any apparent regret, why marriage wasn't for him. He had tried it once, in 1989, when he married actress Talia Balsam. That marriage ended in divorce in 1993, and by his own account, it left him certain that he wasn't built for that kind of permanence. For the next 2 decades, he dated a long list of high-profile women, models, actresses, a professional wrestler, and each relationship eventually ended the same way, warmly, without scandal, and without a ring. The tabloids treated his single life like a running joke, and Clooney leaned into it. He once said that marriage, for him, would feel like a trap he had already tested and didn't like. It wasn't cynicism exactly. It was closer to a kind of self-protection, dressed up as charm. Then came the summer of 2013. George Clooney was at his home on Lake Como, the same lake house that had become something like his personal sanctuary, the place where he escaped the noise of Los Angeles and just existed among old friends. A mutual acquaintance asked if she could bring a friend over. That friend was a British-Lebanese barrister named Amal Alamuddin, a highly regarded international human rights lawyer who had represented clients before the United Nations and worked on cases involving war crimes, extradition, and government accountability. She was in the area and stopped by. By all accounts, from that very first meeting, something in George Clooney shifted in a way his friends had never seen before. What made Amal different wasn't chemistry alone. Clooney had chemistry with plenty of people over the years. What made her different was that she simply wasn't impressed by the things that had always worked on everyone else. She wasn't dazzled by his fame, because her own professional world operated on a completely different currency, legal precedent, international law, human rights advocacy. She had built a serious career representing people in genuinely high-stakes situations, work that had nothing to do with Hollywood and didn't require Hollywood's approval. For a man who had spent decades being the most charming person in almost every room he entered, meeting someone who required substance instead of charm was apparently disorienting in the best possible way. Their relationship developed the way modern relationships often do, through correspondence, phone calls, and long conversations before it became public. Reports at the time described an early period of emails and messages between London and wherever Clooney happened to be filming, followed by their first proper date in London. By early 2014, tabloids had caught wind of the relationship, and the speculation began immediately: could this be the one to finally change George Clooney's mind? In April 2014, the answer arrived. Clooney proposed. The image was almost impossible to reconcile with the version of him the public had known for 20 years, the man who had joked, repeatedly and publicly, that he would never do this again, now down on one knee. Friends who spoke to press at the time described him as uncharacteristically nervous in the lead-up, a word rarely used to describe George Clooney about anything. The engagement itself became global news within hours, covered not just by entertainment outlets but by major international papers, because Amal Al-Muddin wasn't simply George Clooney's girlfriend, she was a respected lawyer in her own right, and the pairing of Hollywood's most famous bachelor with one of international law's rising figures made for an unusually substantive celebrity story. The wedding took place in September 2014 in Venice, and it was, by any measure, one of the most photographed celebrity weddings of the decade. Guests arrived by boat along the Grand Canal. The city itself seemed to organize around the event, with crowds gathering on bridges and along the water to catch a glimpse of the couple. The guest list included some of the biggest names in entertainment and politics, and Italian authorities closed off sections of the city for the ceremony and related events. It had all the visual grandeur the public had come to expect from a Clooney production, except this time, Clooney wasn't the producer. He was the subject. What struck people who knew him, according to interviews given by friends and colleagues in the years since, wasn't the spectacle of the wedding itself. It was the visible change in Clooney's demeanor. This was a man who had spent decades being watched, at premieres, on film sets, in interviews, and who had mastered the art of performing comfort in front of cameras no matter what he actually felt. But people who were there, and people who later spoke about it, described something that looked less like performance and more like genuine relief, as though he had finally set down something heavy he'd been carrying for a very long time. Marriage was one transformation. Fatherhood was another, and by Clooney's own admission in later interviews, it was the bigger one. In June 2017, Amal gave birth to twins, Ella and Alexander. Clooney was 56 years old at the time, and he has spoken candidly since then about how radically it reordered his sense of himself. In multiple interviews over the following years, he described the specific, almost absurd disorientation of realizing that a life built for decades around personal freedom, around flights booked on a whim, around dinners that ran late into the night, around answering to no one but himself, now revolved entirely around two infants who did not care about his schedule, his fame, or his previous 40 years of carefully managed independence. He has talked, with the kind of self-deprecating humor that has always been part of his public persona, about the specific humbling logistics of late-in-life fatherhood, the sleep deprivation, the sheer physical demand of twins, the fact that no amount of professional success prepares a person for two children who need him at the same moment. But underneath the humor, in more reflective interviews, he's described fatherhood as the most significant recalibration of his adult life, bigger, in some ways, than the marriage itself, because it required a kind of daily, unglamorous consistency that had never been demanded of him before. What makes the Clooney marriage a genuinely interesting story, rather than just another celebrity wedding, is the structural tension built into it from the beginning, a tension that has nothing to do with scandal or infidelity, and everything to do with two people running two entirely different kinds of careers that happen to both be extraordinarily demanding. Amal Clooney's professional life did not pause when she married a movie star. If anything, her profile grew. She has continued to work on major human rights cases, represented and advised on matters involving press freedom, war crimes, and international law, and has been appointed to serve on international panels addressing accountability for atrocities. Her work regularly takes her into rooms with world leaders, international courts, and cases with real geopolitical weight. She did not fold her career into his, she kept building it, on its own terms, in parallel to his. George Clooney's career, meanwhile, has continued to pull him toward the traditional machinery of Hollywood, film sets, press tours, the Venice Film Festival, Cannes, production companies, and the version of celebrity built on charm, timing, and public performance. The two of them, in other words, operate in adjacent but distinct worlds, one built on gravity and legal precision, the other built on charisma and entertainment. Reconciling those two worlds inside one marriage, while raising twins, is not a small task, and it's one that Clooney himself has referenced in interviews when discussing how he's had to adjust his own priorities, turning down projects, restructuring his schedule, and being more selective about work in order to be present at home. This is also where Julia Roberts genuinely enters the story, not as a rumored complication, but as a long, well-documented friendship that has outlasted 5 films together and more than 2 decades. Clooney and Roberts first worked together on Ocean's 11 in 2001, and their on-screen chemistry became one of the more reliable draws of that franchise, carrying through Ocean's 12, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, Money Monster, and eventually Ticket to Paradise in 2022. Their off-screen friendship has been publicly affectionate and consistently non-romantic, discussed openly by both of them in interviews for years. Roberts has spoken about how easy and comfortable their working relationship has always been, largely because they've known each other so long that there's nothing left to perform. During the filming of Ticket to Paradise in Australia, which took place during an unusually isolated stretch, Roberts spent extended time away from her own family, and she has spoken publicly and warmly about how much the Clooney family, George, Amal, and their children, meant to her during that period. That detail matters, because it directly undercuts any narrative suggesting friction or secrecy. Amal and the Clooney children were not kept at a distance from Roberts.